Hello, Stephen Hairfield, and welcome to part two of my take on the idea of the Maya prophecy of 2012, December the 31st, 2012. Today, I'd like to talk with you about what I think is going to, or what I sense is what I really should say, and through what I've studied as well. I'd like to share with you what I believe is going to happen to Mother Earth during this shift, so to speak. Um, When Edgar Casey was asked why did he locate his family to Virginia Beach, he gave two reasons. First was he said he thought it was going to be one of the safest places in the United States. And the second reason is because he said it would become subtropical. Here's my take on the shifting magnetic fields of our planet. We know that we're going through a pole shift that was spoken with you about last week. Somewhat. Today, I'd like to enlarge it for you on a geophysical scale. And there's a lot of scientific data that actually even support what I'm about to share with you. Our world, physically speaking, is going to shift. Once the poles, the North and South Pole, take up their new positions and become stationary, our world is literally going to shift on our axis. Whether you're aware of it or not, that process is actually already in the throes of taking place. Have you noticed where the sun rises in the morning and where it sets in the evening? It's a lot further south than what most of us are familiar with. The thing I'd like to share with you is simply this, is that once the poles take up their new positions, then what'll happen is Mother Earth is going to rotate herself and tilt herself to where the North Pole stays north and the South Pole stays south. Let's look at a couple of concepts that support this first. Not sure whether the scientific community is accurate or not when they talk about a global ice age. How can that be? First off, there would be two reasons why there would be a global ice age. The first one would be that the sun went out, and if it did, I'd like to know who climbed up there with a Bic lighter and relit it. And the second reason would be that if the Earth were covered in ash for an extremely lengthy period of time, we're talking many, many, many years, maybe even 100 years, it would be possible that there would be almost a global ice age. But the truth is, it never has been. There's always been an equator. There's always been tropical zones in our world. The reason science says that there was a global ice age is because of glacial activity. One of the things I shared with you in part one in this series was that the magnetic poles have shifted at a minimum of 171 times, well documented by the field of geophysics. Um, I literally had, when I heard that, I took 171 stick pins, and what I did is I placed them randomly, mind you, all over the world. And lo and behold, um, the poles have been on literally every single continent and have actually been centered over the oceans as well. That being said, here's my point. When science says global ice age, they do it because of glacial activity, which they find even in temperate zones. But what happens is when the poles take up their new positions, and you have a polar ice cap now, let's say the Sahara Desert as an example, just picking a spot. That means that would end up in the Arctic North and would become covered in snow and ice. And the interesting thing is, it takes many thousands of years for glacial activity to take place. Well, this cycle that we're faced with is a cycle that's about, give or take, 25,000 years in length. That's ample time for glacial activity to show up at any place on the Earth. My point is just simply that no, we've never had a global ice age. It's just once these poles take up a different position and become stationary in their new position, Mother Earth tilts and rolls. That may sound outlandish, but if we look into the fields of archaeology and geology once more, did you know that the state of Indiana used to be subtropical at one point in the history of our world? Well, if we can document that Indiana itself was subtropical, then It bears out what I'm sharing with you about the polar ice caps and the length of time they stay where they are. Here's another interesting idea that's always kind of fascinated me. Woolly mammoths, a prehistoric pachyderm elephant, so to speak. Whenever we go to a museum like Smithsonian or we see pictures drawn of them, they're always portrayed in an area of ice and snow. Well, that's not possible, and here's why. They're vegetarian. Modern day elephants are vegetarian, and if they were living in ice and snow, they would have starved to death. And the ancient woolly mammoth was a lot larger than our modern day elephants, which means they had to eat constantly, so you would not have found them in polar regions as portrayed. They're warm-blooded beasts is what they were. What I'm doing is I'm attempting to dispel misnomers, because in roughly a little more than a year, well, almost two, being fair, we could see our Earth change its positions. One of the ancient prophecies says this, that the lands and the islands will be moved from their places. Well, if they're going to be moved from their places, that simply means that once the poles take up their new positions, Earth tilts and rolls to make sure that magnetic north is magnetic north once more, and of course magnetic south, the same thing would be true. They're just simply going to move. And once they move, we take up our new positions into the new regions in which we're going to experience climate change. When we look today at the weather, we're seeing weather that's basically defying our comprehension. When have you ever heard of a 300-mile wide cyclone with winds of 184 miles an hour? That's what hit Australia recently. And then when you look at the recent storm here in the United States, it literally had blizzard warnings in 9 states and spanned a distance of over 2,000 miles. That's huge. Is that global warming? No, it's not. It's just simply change in the weather patterns. Why? Because we're taking up new weather patterns. Just as an example, in my predictions for 2011, it was stated that we're going to start seeing tornadic activity in places where we've never seen that. Well, this past year, Queens, New York had a tornado run right through it. So my point with you is all the Earth is doing is taking up her new weather patterns that she's, and for a while, by the way, they're going to be in turmoil. Why? Because the fields, they're shifting and changing, and everything is going to be unsettled. Has to be. But when we look at these weather patterns, they defy our comprehension. Well, here's the beauty of having your comprehension defied. Every time our ability to comprehend is defied, our ability to comprehend greater things is also expanded. So we've got a twofold thing going on here. One, weather patterns to the likes we've never seen. Two, they're defying our comprehension. And three, it's expanding our ability to comprehend greater things. I think that's pretty neat, because Mother Nature is taking care of all of that for us so that we can step into the new dynamic of being infinite beings, which we are anyway. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is to give people a heads up, attempt to give people a heads up. Did you know, as an example, according to the field of archaeology, there are well over 250 cities that they've found under the oceans? What's my point in sharing that with you? These ancient cities are all built very similar, much like the Maya, the pyramid. The closest one to the surface is off the coast of Japan. It's right around 60 feet under the surface. Pyramid buildings. The deepest one they found is at 2,200 feet, and they can only get submarines down there so they can actually see it. Still pyramids. What's my point? Simple. All of these cities at some point obviously had to be on landmass above the water, and they ended up below the water because of the same type of physical shift that I'm talking about now. One of the things that I studied in a book called Pole Shift, which you could get from ARE, which is the Association of Research and Enlightenment. In fact, I think it's the only place you can get it. They offer a metaphysical theorem in this book that says that when Earth finally decides to take up her new position, landmass could end up moving at a rate of about 2,500 miles an hour. That's huge in that kind of a shift. But there's nothing to say that it can. It's just we don't consider land itself moving that fast. But if you look at the idea of the prophecy that I shared with you in the beginning of this video, and that's that the lands and the islands will be moved from their places. Speaking of an island, a few years back, Sumatra had I think it was a 9.6 or 9.7 earthquake. It moved that island well over 100 feet from where it originally sat. So much so that they had to remap the ocean bottom in that area to make sure that they knew what it was like there. Now, if a magnitude 9.6 earthquake can move an island that far, what kind of an earthquake would it take to move a continent? That defies comprehension. But you got to remember something: the Richter scale is open-ended. That being said, whether land moves at that speed or not will remain to be seen. But here's a fascinating story that I also studied in that same book, Pole Shift. They discovered a woolly mammoth in Siberia, very literally floating down a stream after a heavy rain and a block of ice. Well, they got it, studied it. Ironically, the scientists determined that that woolly mammoth had to have been flash frozen. Why? Because it still had undigested vegetation in its stomach, and it had a mouthful of buttercups that it apparently was eating at the time, and it instantly froze. And keeping in mind, a mammoth you do not find in Arctic zones. So you got to ask yourself a question: how did this one end up in an Arctic zone? Another question would be is, what if I'm right on the idea of no global ice age, that the poles and the polar caps have just been located in different continents? That means that what we're about to experience is the very same thing. My suggestion would be is you better hope that the area in the world where you live doesn't become a polar region, because if it does, it's going to look just like the North and South Pole of present day period. And speaking of polar ice caps, there's an ancient map the United States Navy has that shows an island under the Arctic ice cap, which, by the way, of course, satellite telemetry now verifies that that island is indeed there. So you'd have to ask yourself a question: how did the ancient mariners know there was an island there? Simple. It wasn't where the polar regions were as they are today. And I realize full well that what I'm sharing with you indeed somewhat is startling, but there is a lot of basis in fact. If at one point the island under the Arctic ice cap wasn't under an ice cap, then you would know it was there. If the state of Indiana used to be subtropical and now it's not, we know what their weather is like there today. But we can see that all over our world. So the question would be, are we going to become tropical? If Casey is right in the idea that Virginia will become subtropical, then that would mean where I live in northern Nevada would probably become tropical. Think about that. It's well worth it, because things are changing and we know that. As I shared in the first part one of this series, do you feel like something is about to happen? I get to talk with people all over the world, and they share with me constantly that yes, they feel like something is about to happen. And if those feelings are true, we could be looking at the idea of December the 21st, 2012, the Mayan prophecies of a changing world, a changing reality, possibly even dimensions. Stay tuned for my next segment, where we'll be talking more about the global positioning and also the human experience. Thank you. My name is Stephen Hairfield, Dr. Stephen Hairfield, also known as an American monk. You can visit my website at www.hairfield, HAIRFIELD.com. So stay tuned, and thank you, and I appreciate all the subscribers and listeners. Shanti.